This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with author Mark Polizzotti about his new book, Why Surrealism Matters, which chronicles the philosophies and milestones of the iconic 20th century movement. In the conversation, Mark describes the lasting impact that the Surrealist worldview has had on societies worldwide, as well as its ability to transform minds still today. And now, a conversation about the enduring legacy of Surrealism with author Mark Polizzotti. Polizzotti, thank you so much for joining me today on the Art Sense podcast. Mark, you are the author of a new book, Why Surrealism Matters. And I just completed reading the book, and I have so many questions. And I'm just trying to think where to start. A lot of times I start with a hypothetical, which is, say you're sitting at a dinner party next to someone who has no idea, what you do. And you mentioned that you just completed writing a book called Why Surrealism Matters. They're going to ask you to answer that question for yourself, aren't they?
Yeah, why does surrealism matter? Great question. Tough one to answer, even though it seems like a perfectly straightforward one. I guess the way that I would answer it is to think back about to what got me interested in writing this to begin with, which was noticing that there has been a real resurgence of interest in surrealism over the last 5-6 years. And part of the question was simply, why is that? Of course, there are many art movements, but one thing that occurs to me is that unlike movements like Impressionism or Cubism or Fauvism, where there are a lot of really visually stunning works, the reality is that there are some surrealist masterpieces, but there's also a lot of work that, is frankly fairly inconsequential. And I don't know that that in itself carries the interest 100 years later. So what that led me to was the notion that it really is less about the art or the writing or the particular productions. It's really about the ideas underlying all of it. It's about surrealism as a way of life. And of course, you could say part of this is the fact that this is now the 100th anniversary. The official launching of the movement, if you want to date it, was in 1924, in October 24, with the publication of Andre Breton's first Surrealist manifesto. So that, of course, is one easy answer, but I think it goes beyond that. I think it goes into more how people are seeing the world and how the way the Surrealists saw the world is feeling very relevant. I don't know that we can necessarily look to them for answers so much as ways of reframing the questions, but it occurred to me as well that a number of the issues that they were dealing with are actually fairly similar to some of the things we're dealing with today 100 years later. They had just come out of a pandemic, the 1918 Spanish flu. They had just come out of a world war. Well, sadly, as we speak, we're under the shadow of that now. But the part of it that actually is interesting, and that I have to keep reminding myself about, is that neither of those considerations had actually happened when I started pitching this book, when I got the idea for it. This book was first mentioned to Yale University Press, my publisher, in 2019. There was no COVID yet. There was no conflict in the Middle East. Russia had not invaded Ukraine. So all of the things that I can look at and say, look at these correspondences, my gosh, we're going through a similar moment in a number of ways, hadn't actually happened. And yet somehow there was something in the air that suggested, not just to me, but to people I was seeing around me, that surrealism had something very much of the moment to say. That's a very long and convoluted answer to your question.
No,
and I don't know if it actually does answer it, but
it's great. And it sounds like you didn't even realize you were skating to the puck, right?
Exactly. But I think that's part of it. I think that's part of why I think it's that sensitivity to the zeitgeist, to the atmosphere, to what's going on, even to a point that we don't necessarily even recognize, that is what is so fascinating and fundamental about surrealism.
I think one of the things that kind of strikes me right away in the first fourth of the book, halfway through the book, certainly by the time I get to the end of the book, is very quickly my impression of what I thought surrealism was or is was really challenged because, I always kind of put it in a box that had, visual images from, Dali and Magritte, and you think of uncanny, you think of, dream-like atmospheres, but that was at the very best, at the very surface of it all, right? Below it was really about a philosophy, a worldview. And that philosophy and worldview was really spearheaded by one person, right? They had a very specific bell cow, correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, you are first of all, you're absolutely not wrong in thinking in terms of Dali and Magritte and some of the famous writings. I mean, these were their calling cards. Surrealism made its impact via art, via writing, via film. And still today, we call certain producers of various art forms surrealists. David Lynch being a classic example. Certain writers, certain painters. But you're also absolutely right in saying that, and this was one of the things I was trying to bring across the most, is that these works were meant as ways of conveying an idea, conveying a philosophy, conveying a way of living in the world, of being in the world. Surrealism started off largely as a reaction against the rationalist society in which they were living in the early 20th century, which they meaning the original members who sort of gathered together to loosely form this group, that they held responsible for things like World War I, in which a number of them had served, which left them completely horrified, of course. And they held responsible not just the political system, but the entire mental structure of how the Western world worked. When I say Western world, of course, I'm talking largely about France, but, Western Europe. And they blamed centuries of what we would call Greco-Latin logic, the logic in which they had all been educated, as being the root of all evil. And so when you talk about dreamlike atmospheres, or their experiments with the unconscious, or their experiments with sleep states, or automatic writing, or some of the automatic painting, or some of the visual juxtaposition, the jarring visual juxtapositions that they try to put forth, what they're really trying to do is to shake people up and get them to understand that there's another way that one can look at the world. It doesn't have to be this mainstream rationalist worldview. And the reason for that is very simply, what has this done for us? Look at what it's done for us. It's not working. We need something else. This is also why they eventually became involved with the French Communist Party and tried to have an active political engagement, because ultimately the goal was to, as Breton said, to revamp society and human understanding from top to bottom. And that's a large project. And they saw the communists or the leftists as one avenue toward this. Of course, they were talking at cross purposes from almost day one, because the communists were a political party and they had a very specific social economic agenda that was their goal, understandably. And the surrealists they were not politicians. They didn't have a cabinet, they didn't have a platform. They didn't have a series of concrete goals that they wanted to impose, or that they, once the revolution happens, we're going to do this and this and that. They were much more interested in knocking it down and the revolution happening. But that said, one of the areas that is that I found really fascinating, and is one of the thorniest areas to try to parse in their relationships with the Communist Party, is that the communists kept saying to them, that's all great, but it's very idealistic. Like, we can talk about avant-garde literature and art once the revolution has happened and we have imposed the dictatorship of the proletariat, whatever it might be. Because, what you're talking about are post-revolutionary problems. And the surrealist answer is there is no such thing as a post-revolutionary problem, because if you don't address these issues now, all you're going to end up doing is replacing one power structure with the same basic power structure under different names. But it doesn't get you very far, because until you have actually changed the way people think and the way people are in the world and the way their mental attitudes work, we've seen this. It's just replacing one government with another. That won't get you anywhere. So it's an interesting problem because you can see both sides of it. From the politician's point of view, all of this, highfalutin avant-garde literature seems kind of frivolous to somebody who's struggling to put food on the table or is dealing with a politically repressive regime and trying to stay out of jail. I get it. And at the same time, I also understand the surrealist point of view saying, it's important and the workers' conditions is important. But really deep down, what they wanted to do was get people to just think in a totally different way.
You're right. Surrealism, it just keeps bubbling back up. And I was listening to a conversation the other day with the curator, Maria Elena Ortiz, who curated a show at the Modern Art Museum in Fort Worth that's currently going on called Surrealism and Us, Caribbean and African Diasporic Artists since 1940. So it's about how surrealism spread to the Caribbean and African influenced nations that were related to French colonialism. And one of the interesting things she was saying in the conversation was what surrealism shared with these societies. And if we think of somebody like Haiti, the thought that a nation like Haiti, a nation of slaves on a plantation, can rise up against a colonial power like France. What's shared there is somewhere somebody started believing in the impossible, changing the whole framework. To have a revolution, someone needs to start reconsidering impossibilities as being possible. The old adage about keeping fleas in a jar with a lid, and they'll bounce off the lid, and once you remove the lid, they won't jump past the top of the jar. The surrealists were sort of challenging people to think outside of the jar, right?
Yeah, and Haiti is a great example because, as you know from the book, Breton spent some time there. He was sent actually on an official mission during his exile in the United States during the Second World War, and happened to coincide with the Haitian Revolution that deposed Élie Lescaut, the president. Of course, there were people who said afterward, essentially, you sparked the Haitian Revolution, and his answer to that was, "Don't be ridiculous." Of course, I didn't. It was the conditions there that had been building up for years, and it's no surprise that the Haitian people rose up. But there were a number of students who had been at the talks that he gave or the cafe sessions that he had with them, and they said, sure, it was not André Breton's visit to Haiti that suddenly caused this revolution to happen, but the fact that he would talk about things like freedom and personal liberty and political freedom in this kind of context was a revolutionary act, and it did help spark the impetus. And in fact, I think, as I recall, one of the things that put the match to the fuse was the fact that a student newspaper, inspired by having been to a lecture that Breton gave, wrote an article that was a little bit, somewhat aggressive about the power structure, and it was shut down. And then there was a protest against that, and these things, just sort of snowball. And several days later, you've got this massive rioting. So, I mean, I've had these conversations with people who know much more about Haiti and the situation than I ever will, and many of them say, look, it was a pretty minor incident, and I believe that is true, but I don't think it was inconsequential. And by the testimony of people who were actually there and who were personally implicated and personally involved, there was some value, some weight to Breton's presence and the words that he spoke there, and the ideals of surrealism that he was promoting and even discussing at that moment. Another one is Martinique, where he stopped over he and his wife and daughter stopped over en route to the United States at the beginning of the war, when he left France. And that's where he discovered and made contact with Aimé and Suzanne Césaire, who were the two young poets. And eventually Césaire became a major political figure in Martinique. But they too, their attraction to surrealism and their attraction to what Breton was saying had much less to do with things like, automatic writing and the dream states and some of the things that, that people sometimes look at as just parlor games. They were interested specifically in the anti-colonialist stance, which went back to the 1920s. They were interested in the political statements. They were interested in the promotion of revolutionary ideals. So, there again, people take and pick and choose, but it was all part of the same message, ultimately. And these things were important. They did have an effect.
You write about how their philosophy influenced the way they were literally seeing the world. I mean, it's like they were walking down the street trying to find random connectedness and marvels and the extraordinary in the everyday, and looking for those things that are happening just outside our notice, which seem kind of spiritual, and it feels like it almost touches on the psychedelic. And there's a point in that chapter where you're talking about it where it really begins to sound a lot like Timothy Leary in turn on, tune in, drop out, especially when you think about what they were trying to accomplish. They are, by most accounts, anti-work. Yeah, I'd be curious to kind of compare and contrast that. And, I mean, Leary and those experiments with LSD were happening at the height of the Vietnam War, which is just as a tumultuous time as, we have right now. And it doesn't take much digging in our headlines right now to hear high-tech venture capitalists and billionaires talking about microdosing of psychedelics or ketamine or what. I mean, it's interesting to see parallels.
I think it's no coincidence that one of the peak points of resurgence of interest in surrealism, certainly in this country, but not only in this country, was in the 1960s, the late 1960s, the period around 67, 68, because it was very much the same quest. And it was also the same kind of social political pressure cooker situation. You had the Vietnam War, as you said. You had Nixon, which, given who we have today, maybe doesn't seem like such an awful guy. But, in my day and age, when I was a teenager back then, he was villain number one. Sadly, he's been superseded. But it makes perfect sense to me that there would be these experiments going on. In France, of course, you had May 68, which was very explicitly beholden to surrealism, and to the point where some of the slogans that the students scrawled on the walls were actual statements from surrealist texts and surrealist poems. I mean, they were very aware of the fact that they were harking back to some of these surrealist ideals in their own protest. And similar things happened here with Timothy Leary and with experiments in psychedelics. As it happens, the surrealists, by and large, were not major drug experimenters. I mean, some were. Antonin Artaud, of course, was a big believer in peyote. There were some others who did, but André Breton, who was really still the kind of the spiritual leader and the guide for most of them, at least in the Paris group, didn't like drugs. He didn't do drugs. I think there's one episode where he tried, I forget if it was pot or cocaine or something, as an experiment, and was completely useless for the rest of the day. And I'm not going to do this again. But what they were looking for in the marvels of everyday life was not that different from what you can induce with mind-altering substances. And the point of this was to get people out of the mind-numbing sameness and dullness and brain-deadening qualities that they saw around them in our, modern capitalist society. One of the statements back in the first manifesto that Breton talks about is that one of the goals of surrealism is to reconnect with the wonder of childhood. This moment when, at least ideally speaking, this moment when everything is kind of wondrous and everything is new and everything is discovery and your wow buttons are on it every minute. And I don't know that that's all that different really from somebody trying LSD or trying, or experimenting with pot or trying an alternative lifestyle or whatever it might be. People have their ways of trying to cope with this, but the ultimate goal was, again, how do you get outside of that stultifying day-to-day gray reality that the world, our society, Western society, then and now, seems so hell-bent on trying to impose on us, as a way of control, as a way of, keeping you from thinking about other things, whatever it might be.
Another part of the worldview of the Surrealists that comes back under more examination in this era is their relationship with the female, right? Whether that's, hypersexualization, or what was the role of the female voice in their group. And, in the book, you touch on this whole dilemma of women as theory versus women as members of the group. Can you talk a little bit more about trying to reconcile how they felt about females as subject matter and also as members of their group?
Yeah, it's one of the thornier aspects, as you can imagine. It's complex. So on the one hand, you could say that Surrealists, like many other male-dominated art movements, objectified women. They certainly had, a number of women's bodies depicted in various sexualized ways, sometimes in ways that could seem quite misogynistic or sadistic. And that's just a fact. And the reality is that the group was largely dominated by men. They were men of a particular generation and time. They'd all mostly been born right around the turn of the 20th century. Even though on paper they might promote a certain equality or a certain liberation, or a certain what we would almost call proto-feminist ideals, in reality it was hard for them to get through some of their own innate prejudices and fears and insecurities. And you really see it in the way that some of them talk about sex, especially in their more private conversations. Some of them are just scared to death. And I talk in the book about this series of conversations that they had over a period of about 3 or 4 years, toward the late 20s, beginning of the 30s, called the Inquiries on Sexuality. And they're basically a bunch of guys getting together and, trying very genuinely and very sincerely to come to grips with all these taboo subjects, and they'll talk about sexuality, and they'll talk about masturbation, and they'll talk about fantasy, they'll talk, all these and threesomes and all these other things. But underneath it all, there's this sort of sense that these guys are kind of naive, in a way. It's not banter, it's not like braggadocio, but it's coming from a place where you can see that they're not, all that informed. And there is this one, I love this moment. There was one of the few sessions where a woman actually did attend, and she listened for a while and said, you boys need to learn a few things. She got it. But I think one has to be also careful not to just dismiss them as a bunch of, patriarchal misogynists, because I think that there was a genuine desire to offer women an alternative path to the one that French society was offering by and large at the time, which was a very, traditional home, wife and mother kind of path, that it did recognize the creative potential and the creative impetus among a number of women. And, as has been pointed out by a number of women scholars, the Surrealist group over time included far more women in its ranks as active members than pretty much almost any other art movement, certainly at the time. So, I think it's easy to point to the objectification. It's easy to point to the fact that some women did indeed feel marginalized, or, as if they were there. I wouldn't say necessarily as window dressing, but their contributions weren't as valued as some of the men's. Not arguing, but there were a number of others who also said, had it not been for this, I would not have found myself. It offered me possibilities, whether within the group or after, having been part of it and then moved on into their own careers and doing their own things. It's something that I don't think that they would have had it not been for Surrealism. So it's tricky, but I think it's important to be more subtle about it than maybe some some scholars have been. It's interesting too, because as far as I can see, the tide is shifting a little bit. There was a period in the 90s, especially, where it was very much, it seemed to be very much along the lines of, the Surrealists were a bunch of machos and they really trod on these women and that's all there was. And it's interesting to see some people interviewing some of the women artists who had been part of the movement. I'm thinking of, in particular, of this one interview with Merritt Oppenheim, who's the creator of the famous fur-covered cup and saucer,
Right.
which is incidentally one of the most, I mean, with Dali's melted watches, is probably the most iconic surrealist object there is. And the interviewer was basically trying to push her to say, that she was downtrodden and that they, suppressed her, this, that. And she basically kept saying, like, no, it's like, at a certain point, I didn't need it anymore. And I went off and did my own thing. But it was really important to me. So it's interesting to have both points of view. And I think it's a mix of all.
You mentioned the term sadistic in terms of representation, and it reminds me that some of these places that Breton and the Surrealists were drawing from, included, Freud's writing, which has a tendency to really skew sexual, but also Marquis de Sade. Obviously, it's stimulating their imagination, but they really have an attraction for the taboo, right? Yeah. I mean, it's almost like the sledgehammer that they're using to kind of crack open people's minds is the taboo.
They were not subtle. They were masters of like I pointed out in the book, of what we now consider contemporary advertising and publicity techniques. I mean, they had it down. And indeed, one of the weapons, one of the tools that they used was the taboo, was shock. And so one can look at the Marquis de Sade, for example, as being this kind of exemplar of of misogyny and cruelty and all of that. I mean, against women and men. But for the Surrealists, I think it was really more his taboo value. It was the shock value. It was the fact that he was the proscribed author par excellence. His works were, and maybe still are, in the so-called hell section of the National Library. You had to get, special dispensation from the Pope to be able to see them for years and years. That was the interest of it. It was the fact that he had so vehemently pushed back against the taboos of his time. Part of this also was, this was a cry of fury, of anger. I mean, he spent practically half his adult life in jail under one regime or the other, whether it was the king or whether it was the revolution. And, the guy basically felt he had nothing to lose. He was also somewhat unbalanced, but that's a whole other story.
In the book, you talk a little bit about, you talk a lot about the legacy of surrealism. But one of those pillars or branches is dark humor, and kind of the advent of dark humor, and and I think a lot of the and now that I start thinking about it, a lot of where we start seeing dark humor emerge in popular media does sort of go back to that time period of 1968, 69. And can you kind of talk about that aspect and how those two are kind of closely aligned?
Yeah, I mean, Breton, so the notion of what he called black humor, which was what we call dark humor today, excuse me, goes back to the 1930s. Breton eventually published an anthology of black humor, which was an anthology of writings going international, going from Jonathan Swift all the way up to the mid 20th century. And including people like Kafka and Sade, obviously, and any number of others, known and less known, who all epitomize this kind of very disturbing, somewhat cruel at times. I wouldn't call it exactly. It's certainly not mirthful. It's not funny, haha, in that sense. But there's something that kind of tickles you at the same time. It's sort of to varying degrees, it can either make you laugh or not, but there's something that's sort of getting you a little agitated in the way that humor can. And at the time, this was a fairly new and unusual approach to what humor was. Humor was really about conviviality. It was about bringing people together. The surrealist notion of humor is much more alienating. It's like as I said, it's like a time bomb, about going off. It derives a lot from Freud and jokes in the relation to the unconscious. And it, is trying to trace this, again, this kind of notion of marvel in the sense of, something disquieting, something disturbing, something that kind of pulls you outside of yourself, in the same way that, that fabulous coincidences could do, or some of the other things we talked about before, dream states. This is yet another aspect of that. And if you want to talk about a way in which surrealism has really infused our contemporary life, it's almost impossible now for me, to see a series on Netflix, or kids cartoons even. I mean, when my son was growing up back in the 1990s, I'd look at some of the cartoons he was looking at, thinking, my God, this is surrealism. It was the kind of very attitude-soaked brand of humor, sort of dark, a little bit off-kilter, not so much funny in the way that, certainly not like Dick Van Dyke Show funny. It was a very different attitude, and it continues to today, in a number of films. And you're right. I mean, the late 60s, you certainly had, I mean, Buñuel was really, making some of his most impressive films. Jodorowsky was just starting out around then, with those films that, like Magic Mountain and others that are considered to be real high watermarks of surrealist cinema. Others as well. So it's that is an aspect that I think that and advertising and certain kinds of visuals are areas where surrealism has just become so it's become so infused with surrealism that we don't even notice it anymore.
Again, surrealism just seems to have become part of our everyday vernacular. Especially with the advent of AI, people visually are thinking in terms of surrealism and trying to. It's almost like they're asking the computer, help me break my limitation of what I can imagine. So, I mean, I guess that's reinforcing our thesis that surrealism is still relevant.
It is, but I would be careful with that, and I'll tell you why. First of all, the surrealists had a very ambiguous relationship to technology and science. They were not great believers in scientific advance. I mean, of course, the world goes on, I'm very aware of that. They certainly use the telephone like anybody else. But things like the space race and certain, what they saw on that was the very real potential that many people at the time did not recognize of oppression as well. And it's interesting to see, there's a quote that I have in the book from the mid-1960s where they're talking about a surrealist, a later generation surrealist is responding to a critique by Guy Debord of the Situationist International, where Debord was sort of damning the surrealists for being a bunch of old fogies who didn't understand the liberating potential of new technology. And their answer was, be careful what you wish for, because it also has a very different application. And, of course, now that needs no explanation whatsoever. When it comes to AI, I have asked myself the question many times what they would have thought of it. But the one thing that I would say is that, well, two things. My suspicion is that they would not be particularly keen, because one of the things that AI does or can do is to remove from you, the person, the burden of having to come up with these things yourself. Except that that's the point. Coming up with these things yourself, making that effort and discovering who you are and what you can come up with is really the point, much more than the result. AI is very results oriented. It can give you, I can tell it today, write me a manifesto in the style of Breton that's never been done before, and you'll have manifesto number 4 right there in front of your eyes. But what is that really? What is that telling me? What have I really learned there? And the other thing about it is that, and this is why I go back to my statement that some of my colleagues would probably hate me for, about there being an awful lot of derivative, or let's say mediocre or less than stellar surrealist art and writing and productions, because it's not that hard to mimic or copy the style.
Right.
But surrealism is not about a style. And this is one reason why it's extremely difficult to really define, for example, what surrealist art is, because it goes anywhere from the, the hyperrealism of somebody like Dali to these weird kind of abstract forms that somebody like Yves Tanguy painted, to complete abstractions that, some of the surrealist artists of the 1940s were doing. I mean, you look at these things and they have absolutely nothing to do with each other visually, formally. And yet they are informed by, in the best of cases, by a spirit that has to do with that philosophy and that way of living in the world and that way of looking at the world and those mental processes that we were talking about. Breton in Surrealism in Painting says that he sees a painting as a window. And to him, then the real question is, what does that window look out on? So it doesn't really matter what's actually in the canvas, in the frame. It's what are you seeing through that into? And if it's interesting, great. And it could look like anything. And it could be, he liked Dali, obviously. He liked Paolo Uccello. He liked, like a lot of classical and Renaissance and medieval works, because they had that particular quality to them. Whereas others that one would say, oh, this is kooky, this is surrealist, you'll love it. It was just whatever, it just wasn't that interesting because there was no spirit there. There was no thought. So I have a feeling that with AI, what you would get would be a lot of derivative stuff.
Just hearing you talk through that, it makes me think that there's a certain amount of art that is purely abstract expressionist that probably lends itself to that definition of the thought process of surrealism. I'm going to make a painting that is objectively of nothing, about nothing. In my mind, there are artists that have been making through the lens of a surrealism ideal without really being labeled as surrealist, because we think of surrealism as something that's, object A uncannily stuck on object B. But, if we start talking about what were the ideals that Breton wrote about, it really forms a foundation for abstraction, right?
Absolutely. And on top of which, there is an actual historical relationship between the two, because a number of the Abex painters were either in contact with or even sometimes taught by some of the surrealist artists who had come to New York during World War II. I'm thinking of Roberto Matta was one. I think Gordon Onslow Ford was one. Especially the ones who could get around in English and were able to integrate themselves more into the artistic milieu of what was going on in the States. It happens to coincide with the moment where Abex was beginning to take form and these ideas were beginning to circulate. And so there really is quite a, I wouldn't say that one derives from the other necessarily, but there was really there's affiliation there. There are definitely lines of connection between the two. And part of that, I think, does have to do, as you said, with the thought process behind it and what it is that one is trying to express, regardless of the form that it takes. And that's why, as I say in the book, critics like Clement Greenberg, as far as I'm concerned, sort of miss the point, because they're looking at some of these surrealist paintings, especially some of the American surrealists who sort of cottoned on to this and were producing work that, as I said, was all form and no spirit, and looking at them and, looking at them formally and saying, there's not a whole lot here. It's kind of kitsch, and he wasn't wrong, but he didn't entirely get what was supposed to be happening there.
I spend a lot of time talking to people about art. I spend a lot of time studying art. I love learning. I don't know if I should be ashamed that I hadn't read, Breton's manifesto, hadn't gone deep on surrealism to really understand it as a worldview and a philosophy. But I appreciate you helping me be better informed about surrealism so that I can get past a melting clock.
Well, thank you for saying that, because that, if there was any real hope and goal for this book, it was, of course, people don't know that you're not born knowing this stuff. And the world of surrealism scholarship is pretty small when you get down to it. And if I can inspire someone to learn a little bit more, then I've done my job. So thank you for saying that. I appreciate it.
Mark, I really appreciate the time you've taken today to have this conversation about surrealism in your book, Why Surrealism Matters, published by Yale Books and available, I believe, just about anywhere someone gets their books.
I hope so.
So, Mark, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for being here.
Craig, well, thank you very much for the invitation. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Awesome. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to Cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.